thank you to everyone who has joined, and thank you to International CONFEX and Skyline Whitespace for this webinar. My name is Natalie, and I'm here to talk to you about how can virtual events better meet the needs of exhibitors and sponsors. So I am the content marketing lead at Explory. And if you aren't familiar with Explory already, Explory is an event feedback platform, and we specialize in measuring attendee experience metrics for virtual and live events. So I actually started my career as an event marketer at Informa, and then I went on to work as an in-house marketer / event organizer for a technology brand before I joined Explory. And really, joining Explory has felt like a full circle moment for me, in that it's identified some of the things that I struggled with as an exhibitor for a small to medium business, but also really highlighted to me things that I could have done whilst I was working organizer side to really improve that experience for my exhibitors. So I'm tackling this presentation from that perspective of someone who has worked organizer side, but also someone who has experience exhibiting as well. So in terms of today, it's not going to be a super long presentation. I'm going to be speaking for about 20 minutes. And so there are going to be plenty of opportunities to ask questions at the end. So what I would say is, as I'm going through, if any questions pop into your mind, just pop them in the Q&A box and I will get to them towards the end of the session. In terms of what I'll be talking about today, I'll be going into how are virtual events performing in the eyes of attendees and exhibitors, as well as, are virtual events a stopgap, or are we seeing a long-term trend here? Is it something that we really need to take note of? And finally, how can organisers improve the overall experience of their virtual events? So let's start with how are virtual events performing at the moment? So I'm sure there'll be many of you who had a very interesting experience around March of this year of having to think about whether or not you transfer those live events you had planned into virtual events. And I find the most interesting way of sort of characterizing this pivot as this Google Trends chart. And what this is a chart from Google that demonstrates the popularity for the search term virtual events this year. And you can see right around that March point where there was just a surge in interest, and that's continued throughout the rest of the year. And so around this time, we were thinking about what does this mean for the attendee experience? Because we have such a huge wealth of data when it comes to the live or face-to-face experience. We have over 3 million data points on that. So around that point where lots of organisers were thinking about, do we pivot? Should we do that? We were started to collect data, benchmarking data on attendee experience for virtual events, which meant we had to put in place some new survey templates for attendees and exhibitors and sponsors. And we have a set of core KPI benchmarks, which are now stable, but new benchmarks will become available over time. So let's dig in. The first thing to note is that attendee sentiment is positive when it comes to virtual events. And here I'm looking at the overall satisfaction benchmark scores from Explory for live trade shows, live conferences, and virtual events. And by virtual events in this context, I'm talking about virtual events which have taken place across a number of days, include multiple different streams, networking elements, and exhibition as well. And here from the scores, what you can see is that the virtual experience is actually pretty stable in terms of, and in line with the trade and conference experience. And when we look at the Net Promoter Score, you can see that, again, it's in line between the virtual and the trade, but tracking ahead of conferences. But where virtual events really excel in terms of the benchmarks is where it comes to value for time in the eyes of our attendees. And it's not surprising, is it? Because the effort required to attend a virtual event really is equal to the effort it takes to lift up your laptop or walk from one room to another to your desk. But what about our exhibitors? When it comes to exhibitors, sentiment is not so positive around virtual events. And we already knew that we had some way to go in the live event model where Net Promoter Score is sitting down at -17. But look where we are for virtual events. That Net Promoter Score has really dropped, and it's in large part driven by the perception of exhibitors that they aren't quite able to attribute the return on investment for participating in virtual events. So what does this mean for the future of virtual? Does it mean we need to throw in the towel, just forget about virtual until we can get back to live events? No, that's not what we're seeing in the research. And actually, we conducted a piece of research earlier this year in partnership with UFI and supported by CISO. And within that research, we were looking at the sentiment towards the virtual events and some of the relative strengths and weaknesses. So at the time, this research was taken up till the end of August. And at that time, about 50% of visitors and 50% of exhibitors said they had participated in a virtual event. Now, at this time of the year, by this point, I would expect that number to be much higher, probably around the 80% mark. And there were about a quarter who said they'd either organised their own virtual event or they had taken part in a dedicated sponsorship experience. And this is what we found. So amongst visitors, there's an overwhelming preference for live when it comes to networking, when it comes to the overall experience, and also doing business. But that's not to say that they don't see the value in virtual events. Actually, they talk about in some instances where virtual events are better than or actually on par with the face-to-face experience. And the ways in which they talk about virtual events being better is when it comes to looking at value for time, when it comes to looking at value for money. And they talk about virtual events being on par with live events when it comes to content. So if you have visitors who are coming to your event with the objective to consume content, to keep up to date with trends in the market, to remain educated, they actually see virtual events as a good alternative to in-person events for this. But what about our exhibitors? Our exhibitors are saying the same. They have an overwhelming preference for live, particularly when it comes to networking, when it comes to the overall experience, but especially for generating leads. And if I take you back to that quarter I was talking about who organised their own event or taken part in a dedicated sponsorship experience, that small percentage that we had surveyed who said they'd taken part in a dedicated sponsorship experience, they still had a preference for live over virtual, but what we saw in the data was that they were actually starting to warm to virtual events. And it was indicative of this sort of reassessment of virtual events and how they could actually measure the return on investment and how they could actually achieve their objectives. And I think it's very interesting because I haven't spoken to a single organizer over this time who has said, you know, as a result of making my event virtual, I've had far less attendees than I would for my in-person event. And so it's been the opposite. People have actually been able to extend their reach much further than they have before. And I think this is an interesting thing to think about when you think about the objectives of exhibitors at events, because this is something that we've also tested and looked at and researched over time. And some of the three common objectives for exhibitors is to generate new sales leads, it's to increase the brand position, and also to increase awareness around that brand. So we can see that there's an opportunity there if we're able to build that bridge between our exhibitors and this extended reach that virtual events get. And even though there's some gap in the experience at the moment, exhibitors understand that there is potential there with virtual. And as much as, you know, with organizers, you really had to reskill to get virtual events off the ground, exhibitors are also having to rethink their approach to how they exhibit at a virtual event. And the early indications is that though sentiment is low at the moment, exhibitors are really willing to go on that journey to access the sort of untapped potential of virtual events. And there's a last part from the UFI research I wanted to share with you, which is this idea of dipping your toe in with virtual. So one of the questions we asked in that survey was, if an event was organised as a hybrid, would you be more likely to attend it in person or virtually? And the results came back to show that if it was an event they had previously attended in person, they were much more likely to want to attend that event in person again rather than virtually. And where this gets really interesting is if it's a new event. If it's a new event, they're almost as likely to want to attend that event virtually as they would in person. And the reason I think that's really interesting from the organizer perspective, but also for exhibitors, is because it represents this new section almost of the attendee acquisition strategy. And what it means is it presents an opportunity to leverage and have that extra audience on your event. And also, you know, the attendees are looking at it, they get to touch and maybe taste a bit of what that event's about. But also that provides an extra pool of candidates and leads for your exhibitors to leverage. So I think it's something it's interesting to keep in mind, especially as we're moving into next year, and there's a lot of talk about hybrid and sort of how we pull that all together. But I think that's an interesting insight that we should hold in mind going into next year. But how do we actually set exhibitors up for success? I think that's something that's kind of on the tip of everyone's tongue at the moment when it comes to virtuals. How do we actually help exhibitors make this work? And in order to really address this, I'm digging into the Explori archives a bit here. And I want to share a piece of research we did back in 2017. And I'll explain a bit about why I thought that research is still relevant today. So back then, what we looked at was a set of organizer behaviors. And we asked event directors if they did these behaviors with all exhibitors, with most exhibitors, or with key exhibitors, or none of their exhibitors. And what we were trying to understand is what is the difference between those organizers who have more of a traditional sort of approach to their events versus those who have a bit more of an innovative approach. And then we mapped their net promoter scores over the top. And this is what we found. So the purple section of the bar are those organizers who have more of a traditional approach, and the blue section is those who have a more innovative approach. And just by looking at it straight away, you can see that the blue bar has higher net promoter scores than those who have the more traditional approach in the purple bars. And if I just zoom in on some of these behaviors, so accepting short-term compromises such as discounts, maybe enhanced packages, if it's perceived that they'll benefit the long-term relationship with the exhibitor. Offering exhibitor training was another one. Spending one-to-one time after the event with the exhibitor to understand whether or not their objectives were met, but also spending time understanding why that exhibitor wanted to exhibit in the first place. And the reason I wanted to share this with you is because when I was presenting those benchmarks earlier, and yes, exhibitor sentiment is low, but it doesn't mean that there are no organizers who are doing virtual events well. And so recently what I've been doing is speaking to some of our clients who are actually doing really well against the benchmarks. And those case studies will be coming out next year, so keep your eyes out for those. But when I was talking to these clients, there's a key theme that came up, and it was a theme about collaboration. And this idea that, as an organizer going through this time, like I said before, you're having to reskill, right, and learn how to deliver virtual events. Equally, exhibitors are having to learn how to exhibit virtually. So there was this real sense of collaborating with exhibitors. And a lot of the things that were mentioned were understanding the objectives of exhibitors and also offering exhibitor training within that, being clear with exhibitors about what does this virtual event platform look like and how do you actually use it? Not in terms of the sort of admin task of this is how you book a meeting, for example, but how should you leverage it? And different platforms will obviously allow you to do different things, but how do you initiate conversation? How do you create the sort of traffic that you would get to a booth, but in a different sort of way? So I think it's really important when you look at this, not to think that any one behavior is the most important behavior to do, but seeing it more as a suite of activity that needs to be employed in order to really support exhibitors in achieving their objectives. And so how do you go about delivering a good virtual experience for your exhibitors? And, more be it for me to tell anyone on this call, I'm sure there's many of you on this, sitting in on this, who are far more experienced in terms of creating and designing experiences. So that's not what I'm going to talk about here, but really I'm just going to give you a framework for how you can gather exhibitor feedback in a way that it can be embedded in your event strategy and really just deliver against their objectives and create an experience that they enjoy. And it starts by developing a robust feedback strategy. And anyone who has seen me talk before knows I carry this loop with me everywhere, because I think it's a really useful framework for anyone that you can take away and start using. But it starts with the first step, which is to gather your measurement data. It's a 5-step process. And I think the really interesting thing about virtual events at the moment is they provide such a wealth of data. It's end to end and really at no extra cost or little extra cost to the organizer. So typically at a face-to-face event, you might have to invest in some sort of tracking technology to get a real insight into what your attendees are doing at your event. But a lot of this at the moment is actually baked into the virtual event platforms. So you can track from registration through to, meetings data, session data, and at the end, your feedback survey to get a single view of the impact for the event. But I think what's also interesting is how we leverage this extra insight to help our exhibitors achieve their objectives. So one thing I was thinking about here, for example, is if we talk about, we're used to, in a face-to-face experience, having traffic past our booth. And that's how we initiate conversation, right, on a trade show floor. But in the absence of that, in a virtual event, how do we start those conversations? And if we take something like session data, which is something we gather during the event, and if we make, for example, available who's attending a session, then that provides a natural conversation starter between an exhibitor and an attendee that can be used to really start the conversation, which can lead to obviously talking about the product or service they offer, especially if that session is very topical to what they do. So that's just a small example. And I know we have to be careful, around data regulations and all of that, how we actually manage that. But I think it would be interesting to think about, of the wealth of data that we're able to gather from virtual events, what can we use to improve the exhibitor experience or to help exhibitors with making those connections with the audience that they're trying to reach. And then if we go back to the loop, to close the loop, you go from gathering your measurement data, you want to then analyze and report on that data. And you definitely want to communicate those findings back. Between analyze and report and communicate is often where the loop breaks down. But, you communicate these findings back maybe in your event debrief or your wash-up meeting. And then from there, agree on a strategy and execute on that strategy, and the loop starts again. It's really important, particularly when it comes to your survey data, to gather your attendee and exhibitor feedback separately. And that way you're keeping the exhibitor experience at the core of what you're doing. You're really getting to grips with what is it that our exhibitors are struggling with, how is it that we can help them, and baking it in to the event strategy. So in summary, exhibitor sentiment, yes, it's low, but early signs indicate that they see the potential of virtual and are willing to go with organisers on that journey. They see the wealth of data available there, and they know that there's potential, but I think it's just teething issues. We really need to get to a space where we understand how to leverage virtual events. And virtual events are here to stay, and they present a useful opportunity for exhibitors to achieve their main objectives, like I was talking about, generating sales leads, increasing the brand position, and increasing brand awareness. And finally, to maintain that exhibitor experience, it's important to adopt a suite of organizer behaviors that really support that. So that's again where I was talking about exhibitor training, understanding the objectives of exhibiting and assessing how they've been met after the event as well, and developing a robust feedback strategy that puts exhibitor experience really at the core and delivers against those objectives. So some of the research I actually presented, I mentioned, was from the research we did in partnership with UFI and supported by CISO, and that was part one. And part one was very much focused on how attendees and exhibitors are feeling in the absence of live face-to-face events. But we are shortly to release part two, and part two has a particular focus on the future of digital and hybrid events. So if you do want to join the waitlist, you can visit explory.com/GRI-part two, and we will send that out to you as soon as it's available. So this is the end. I'm just going to jump into Q&A. I'm going to leave that up for anybody who needs to screenshot or visit the website. But has anyone got any questions? Blessing, can you send me details on Exploring? Yep, I will send you across details. Absolutely. If you also want to take down my email address, you can just drop me across a message and I will send over everything. What is the best way to tell if you've met the audience's needs? I think that's a great question. And I would say the best way to know if you've met the audience needs is really to ask them. And by ask them, I do mean, sending out a survey. Because the great thing, obviously, that I talked about with virtual events is you have all of this data available to you about how they've engaged during the event. But having the data about how they engaged doesn't really give you any context for your next event in terms of what they need. Like, have they actually met their objectives in a meaningful way? Will they come back to my event? All those kind of rich questions are what you can get into with your survey data. So the best way to tell if you've met their needs is really to survey them and ask them. Question about finding any differences in response between industry sectors. Mike, I'm assuming you mean in response to the sort of sentiment towards virtual events between sectors. There isn't any particular difference that we're seeing at the moment, no. Recommendations for getting more leads via virtual events. I think that's a difficult question to answer. And I don't think I've quite cracked it myself, being someone who exhibits virtually. But what I would say is, in some ways, it depends on the platform. I think it's really good if you're able to get a speaking slot. I tend to find that's a good way to generate leads if your company lends itself well to sort of sponsorships, to thought leadership content, for example. I think that's normally a good way if you can get your downloadable content in front of them. That's also another way to generate leads via virtual. In terms of virtual events that allow networking, I would say I found more useful striking up conversations on mutual ground. So I've attended this session. This was a really interesting point. What did you think? And just literally networking. Pretty much one person had told me this before, actually. They said, before it was called social media, it was called social networking. People are used to talking online or chatting via text. So I tend to strike up conversations that way, and then that leads to booking in a meeting. So I hope that helps. How do you suggest we send details of those attending sessions to exhibitors? I think some platforms actually make this available. So some platforms will show you who has registered for that session. So if you've added that session to your agenda, it will actually show you the list, or during the actual live stream of that talk, it will show you who's in the room. If that is not available through the platform, I'm not entirely sure how you're able to share that data. I wouldn't want to give any legal advice on that, but I think it's something that you should check with your in-house team, any GDPR specialists you have in-house, to see if there's any way around that. Do you think calling for feedback is better than an online questionnaire, or could you do the questionnaire first with follow calls if needed? I'm wondering if by that, do you mean, what do you mean? If you're thinking about post-event surveys here, those, I'm thinking that those would be delivered online. So e-surveys, I would say, are the best way to gather that sort of feedback. And you can gather bits of feedback in between. So you might want to be rating speaker sessions, or you might want to be gathering things on polls, for example. So that all that data is available and possible to collect for you. But I would say if you're looking at sort of, was this event valuable to the attendee, that's the sort of question you really want to ask at the end of the event. Exhibition and virtual event are relatively passive. Do you have any tips for how exhibitors can maximize the opportunity, or how an event design can assist? Again, I don't have the answer, unfortunately, but I would say to that point, I've just found from my experience exhibiting virtually that striking up conversations has been the way that I've generated traffic. I've kind of, in some ways, much like some organisers have found that trying to replicate the face-to-face experience online hasn't quite translated. I think what I noticed from exhibiting virtually is that trying to exhibit online the way I would face-to-face also doesn't work. So I find, for me so far, the thing that I found that works well is just, again, stimulating conversation based on common ground, and then going for the ask of, do you want to book in a meeting? So I'm not sure in terms of event design how that can be assisted, but that's one of the things that I found works for me. Would you recommend selling sponsorship content over exhibition for virtual events? I think there's a case for it. I think there is a potential case for it from the early signs that we've seen in the research we did in partnership with UFI and supported by CISO. So where I was talking about those people who have the dedicated sponsorship experience, again, they prefer live, right? We all would want to get back to face-to-face events as soon as we can. But there is this sort of sentiment that there is value in virtual events, and they're starting to see the potential there, and they're starting to see that potential ROI. So I think there's a case for selling sponsorship, but I don't know if that would be at the expense of exhibitions. I think that's hard to say at this point. Should we be managing exhibitors' expectation regarding footfall and leads prior to selling exhibition space? And do we need to guide exhibitors on being more proactive rather than just sitting on their stands? I think that's a really, really great point. And to kind of hark back to the case studies that I've been gathering with clients who've been doing well against the benchmarks, it's really been, and I go back to the word collaborative, but the sense I get from them is that it's saying to them, you know, the trade show model that we normally run, the live event model we normally run, is tried and true. We know it through and through. If you had any questions, we could answer them for you really easily. But we're learning as much as you are in terms of virtual events, how to make this work. So I think that sort of transparency is important at this point, because we are in such a sort of early stage of adopting this. And I think, yeah, being transparent about footfall, about, you know, this is what, especially if you've run a virtual event already, saying, you know, you're not going to get, I don't know, 10,000 people passing your stand, but here's how you can extract value from what we're doing. I think that's where it becomes really valuable for that relationship between both organizer and exhibitor. Do you have the feeling that hybrid events are becoming the favorite choice for B2B trade organizers, or is there still an in-person versus virtual trend? I think there's interest in hybrid events. I think, you know, everyone on this call has probably heard, you know, 2021 is probably going to be the year of hybrid. And we just don't know. We don't know anyone who has run a hybrid event yet. And I think what I'm sort of expecting is that the moment we can run our shows as we'd like to, there's just going to be a sort of a frenzy almost, and just lots of awkward lingering hugs from people on show floors who are just excited to be out and about again. So it's hard to say whether or not hybrid is the favorite choice. I think personally, I think it should be considered, just because of the extended reach that we're able to see with virtual events. But I think the real challenge is really understanding how do you weave in the virtual elements as well as the in-person elements? Do you keep them separately? Do you bring them in together? And I think much like this year, where people have been trying to figure out how do we make an in-person event virtual, when we get to a point where we're organizing hybrid events, it's going to be how do we take these two sort of disparate component parts and weave them in together, should we? And I think that's going to take some sort of trial and error to really get there. Okay, well, I think that is it on the question front. So once again, I just want to thank the sponsors, Skyline Whitespace, and make sure that you join Julian Agostini alongside Paul Saw, Ray Bloom, and Simon Kimball as they look back on the resilience of the events industry on next week's webinar. And of course, again, if you want to get access to the part 2 of the Global Recovery Insights project, make sure you take a picture of this screen and pop it into your search bar, and we'll send that out to you as soon as it's available.